Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be discussing fate dice and how to use them in your games. So as most of you guys know by now, fate dice have been reduced from 12 to 6 in the last balanced data slate. And of course, I'm not talking about the recent point changes, I'm talking about the balance change before that, when we also had the Night Spinner nerfed and so forth. So we've been, rocking 6 fate dice for a while now. And let me tell you, I have noticed a difference in the way I have used fate dice from the last balanced data slate. I'm very conservative with them now, and I only use them for moments that are truly important or game-changing. And that, of course, was not the case before. I was pretty liberal with my use of fate dice way back when we had 12 of them, and now I'm a lot more conservative. And that switch has had implications not only with me, but with Eldar players everywhere, as basically everybody's kind of doing the same thing. Very conservative with their fate dice, only using them once or twice a game on very important moments. So it's my hope in this video that I can kind of bring you through my thought process on using fate dice and how to use them most effectively after the balanced data slate. But before we get into that, I do want to clear something up, a couple things really about the last video I made about orcs. I put out a video kind of detailing how to beat orcs and what was strong in the Eldar army against orcs. And after reading a couple comments, I do feel like I gave people the wrong impression in that video. So I do want to take a moment to clarify a couple of things. First and foremost, I in no way meant to demean or put down orc players in any way or make an assumption that orc players were somehow less intelligent than other players in the game. Absolutely, completely not my intention. The jokes I made were not directed towards the orc players, but towards the orcs themselves as a, fictional species. And in fact, the orc player that I play against when I do play games against orcs is a much smarter person than me. He is an engineer. He spends all day working on complex math equations and formulas, which I wouldn't begin to know how to do. And on top of that, he's a really awesome guy, and he has a lot of fun playing the game. Now, we actually had a conversation before the game even took place. I told him beforehand that I wanted to try out, a couple new things that I thought would be effective against Greentide. And he also said that he wanted to try out something a little different with his Greentide list as well. So we got together to play a game because both of us wanted to try things that we thought would be effective on the battlefield. And that's it. My list wasn't technically tailored towards orcs. There was one unit that I wanted to try versus Greentide, which was, of course, a Zerman and the 10 Dire Avengers. So that is a thing. But I wouldn't say that I went out of my way to tailor against, my buddy. Because at the end of the day, I didn't know how well it was going to work truly on the battlefield. On paper, it sounds good. I've had many discussions with other Eldar players in the community, and we've kind of come together and formed a consensus about what is good and what isn't good against the Greentide. And the one unit I did want to try out was Dire Avengers because it was a unit that I was kind of on the fence about. On the other hand, he usually runs a kind of a slightly different Greentide list, but this time he wanted to try out Grotskull, so he threw in Grotskull, and, it just so happened that the game didn't really work out in his favor. He got a little bit unlucky. I did get the first turn. But regardless of what the result was of that game, my point in showing you guys that was to kind of illustrate some tips and strategies and, kind of some damage parameters that are useful to know and apply to your games against orcs. So that was my point in showing you guys that. And again, I in no way intended to kind of demean my opponent. Obviously, there were some moments where he got really unlucky in the game, and Eldar is a tough matchup in general against orcs if the Eldar player brings the right units. It's a much different story if that Eldar player is bringing a more single entity oriented builds with the Yin-Karn or the Avatar of Cain, for example, or maybe even a Wraith Knight, are going to struggle a lot more against the Greentide, without a doubt. And the last thing that I want to address is that my buddy is not a bad orc player. So I think there's a misconception, at least among a couple of you guys out there who might play orcs, looking at the result of the first couple turns might think, well, obviously, if he's losing that bad right off the gate, he must be bad. But I have to say, again, that's absolutely not true. And for those veterans out there who could kind of, fill in the blanks, put the pieces together. And again, I didn't go over a very detailed explanation of every single little thing that happened. But you veterans out there will notice that it was kind of set up in a way where he was going to lose a couple units regardless of what he did. That's just kind of the hand he was dealt. And when he did have the chance to kind of come back to it, and by the way, orc players, I don't care who's playing them, who's piloting the orc army, orc players are going to lose units in the first couple turns of the game. That's just how it goes. The thing that really, I think, turned that game was the failure of the jump, which obviously was a catastrophic failure, right? So, is my buddy, the best orc player in the world? No. And I'm not the best Eldar player in the world. But we put together a game that, we both learned from. And again, one last time, that game was meant to give you guys an example of the kind of way you have to play against orcs as the Eldar. And that's it. It definitely wasn't a moment to brag or to, make fun or anything like that whatsoever. So, if you guys had that impression out there, I just want to set the record straight on that one. All right, so now that that's out of the way, we can start the video proper. And I'm sorry that I had to address that, but, there were some nasty things said in chat about my friend, and he actually saw the video and he was a little sad about it. So I just wanted to set the record straight on that account. Okay. So what we're going to be looking at in today's video is the Strands of Fate rule and what it does. We're going to be addressing rerolls and fate dice. And we're going to be talking about the best times to use fate dice in your games. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the rule Strands of Fate itself. You basically roll 6 dice at the start of the battle, and if you don't like the result, then you can re-roll them. Typically, higher numbers are better, of course. If you do choose to re-roll them, you roll 1 less each time. As for what they do, the results that you roll can be used to substitute for an advance roll, a battle shock test, a charge, a damage roll, a hit roll, a saving throw, or a wound roll once per phase. So you can't use multiple dice in the same phase. You can only use 1 per phase. But you only have 6 of them anyway, so usually this isn't going to be that big of a deal. And that's basically it, right? There are a few ways that an Eldar army can generate extra fate dice. We have the Weeping Stones enhancement, which allows a unit or, the bearer's unit to gain fate dice if you kill an enemy unit. You have, of course, Eldrad Uthran, which adds 3 fate dice to your pool. And you have both Guardians and Wraith Lords who generate fate dice as well. Guardians for, controlling an objective, and Wraith Lords for killing enemy units. So before I get into where you should be concentrating your fate dice rolls in your games and what situations might occur that you would want to use a fate dice, I do want to address rerolls and fate dice, because this is a little bit of a controversial topic in the Eldar community and the Warhammer community at large. And basically it comes down to people, both Eldar players and other players, not liking the idea of being able to sub in a fate dice on a reroll. However, I do want to say that the Strands of Fate rule states before making a dice roll. So keyword being A there, right? As a reroll is a dice roll. And nowhere in the rules is there a stipulation that a reroll is not a dice roll. And on top of that, there is nowhere in the rules that it states that a reroll is somehow different to a regular dice roll as far as the different rules that interact with it. And I think a great example of this is things like critical hits, right? So if you have a weapon that deals a critical hit on a dice roll, again, it's using the same language there, a dice roll. Not only can you score a crit on a regular dice roll, but if you had anything that allowed you to reroll the dice, you could also score a crit on that reroll. So just as the rules are written in the core rules of the rulebook, there's nothing stopping you from subbing in a fate dice on a reroll itself. However, a lot of players took that as a, well, this is not what is intended. I'm not going to do this because I don't want to be, pardon my French, but a dick, right? However, there's proof that GW intends it this way, both it's intended and its rules as written. So here it is. Both GW in their World Championships of Warhammer Tournament FAQ, and as of recently, the WTC have ruled that you can use fate dice on a reroll. So it has been clarified by both the WTC and GW. So no matter what set of rules you choose to follow, both the WTC and GW have clarified that fate dice can be used on a reroll, period. And because of this ruling, it's made pretty much clear that GW had intended it this way from the beginning. And WTC following as well also backs that up. So if you're an Eldar player out there and you're subbing fate dice for rerolls, that's perfectly fine. You're playing the game as it should be, by the book, and that's it. You're not being a jerk or anything like that. And I know that some members of the community out there might frown on players doing that, or they might refuse to do it themselves. But what can I say? That's just how it works. That's how the rules are written. You can't blame somebody for playing something that is in the rules. Pure and simple. And as a little bit of an example, I guess, on how sometimes things can seem weird, but are actually perfectly legal in the rules, look at how eliminators operate in a Space Marine army, right? When used alongside impulsors. The eliminators can shoot, move with their ability back inside of the impulsor and embark, and then shoot again using the firing deck special rule. Because technically speaking, the impulsor hasn't shot yet. So therefore, because firing deck is just basically adding more weapons to the impulsor can shoot the eliminator's weapons. Should it really work like that? Probably not, logically speaking, but that's how the rules are written, and that's the game we're given. So, same thing with fate dice. You can use fate dice on a reroll. So, having said that, should you ever reroll your original 6 fate dice? Well, if you have a Farseer in your list, I would say no. You're probably fine not doing it. However, if you don't have a Farseer, I would highly suggest you reroll a few times for a 6, or at least a collection of pretty high numbers, a couple 5s, couple 4s, things like that. However, before deciding if you want to reroll those 6 dice, because again, you do lose 1 with each reroll, become familiar with what you will need fate dice for and what you can spend other resources achieving. So, if you only need a 6 for an advance roll, maybe you don't need to reroll the dice if you get a couple 5s or something like that, right? Because you can always use matchless agility to be able to boost that advance roll to a 6. So when building an army, those are things you should be thinking about as to what you want to use your fate dice for in any given game. All right, so what are the best times to use fate dice? So I think really there's 6 things that you want to be using your fate dice on, and they're, kind of in varying importance. Overwatch being 1, devastating wounds, advance rolls, saving throws, battle shock tests, and lastly, charge rolls. Overwatch is basically a reactionary stratagem where a unit moves, either starts or ends a move, or, charges in, you get to shoot them. But you need to hit on 6s. Now, the great thing about fate dice is you can use a 6 on a fate dice for Overwatch to hit automatically. And guys, this is arguably the most powerful way to use fate dice. I personally think it is the best and most reliable way to get damage on enemy large targets against multiple different types of opponents. And when I have heavy weapons in my list, bright lances, fire dragons, pulse lasers, whatever it is, I always make sure that I try to at least get 1/6 in the beginning of the game, because having that in your back pocket could very easily convert into solid damage against an enemy vehicle or monster. And in a lot of cases, it can prevent your opponent from moving into a certain area of the board altogether. If you combine this with the ability to fish for a natural 6 by subbing in a reroll, this makes it very strong, because sometimes you don't even have to use that fate dice to begin with. For example, if you want to overwatch with a Warwalker, you fire off those 2 Bright Lances, roll 2 dice, you have a 33% chance of at least one of them coming up a 6. If that happens, then you don't even need to use the fate dice, or perhaps you can even sub in the one that missed for another 6. So you can actually hit with 2 Bright Lances on a single overwatch, which is insane damage against a large target if your opponent fails their saves. And because it's done in their own turn via Overwatch, there's very little reactionary stratagems that they can actually use to protect themselves. So for example, if your opponent wants to pop smoke, they can't do that because you can only use smoke screen in your opponent's shooting phase, and it's currently their movement phase. And if for whatever reason you have a weapon that has sustained or lethal hits, like you have the Avatar of Cain or Fuegan, who both have sustained hits on their weapons, this makes it even stronger, because that 6 that you just used is automatically going to proc sustained hits. If you have lethal hits, then that means it's automatically going to wound as well. So in my opinion, if you have any kind of lance weapons or any kind of heavy anti-large weapons in your list, those single shot weapons with a lot of power, you want to be prioritizing using your 6s for Overwatch, because they're going to give you consistent damage and they're going to give your opponent something to think about. The next thing you probably want to use your fate dice on in certain circumstances is devastating wounds. Now, in the beginning of the edition, this was basically what you always wanted to do, but, it's really today only used for finishing off really tough targets. If you're shooting at something like a Monolith or a Baneblade or something and you need just a couple of extra wounds, you don't have any units in grenade range or anything like that, using a fate dice for a dev wound can be clutch. It's definitely more useful on things like D cannons with a high base damage, D6 plus 2 damage, which will average 5 or 6 devastating wounds if you actually proc it on a wound roll. That is basically going to seal the fate of a lot of vehicles out there and monsters. It's not that great on weapons though, with just D6 damage due to the variability. If you proc the wound on devastating wounds and then you roll a 1 or a 2, that's really feels bad, and there's not a lot you can do at that point except use a command point for maybe a command reroll. That's about it. Also, you probably want to keep an eye out for finishing off enemy characters with your own characters if you have precision. So things like the Death Jester, for example, or Illic. If you have the opportunity to finish off a character with a dev wound, that is a good way to use it as well. All right, but what about advance rolls? So advance rolls is something that I've spoken a lot about on this channel, using fate dice for advance rolls. But is it always the best choice? Because there are other ways in which we can advance 6 inches, right? We do have a stratagem that does it, and we do have the option of, sometimes spending points on a Warlock to do it, and there's a couple of other things in our index that allow us to do it as well. So advance rolls, of course, can be used to get your units into a better position early in the game or get to an important position later in the game. But this largely depends on what units you have in your army. So, for example, if you have a unit of Storm Guardians and you need to get up to that objective to make it sticky or to screen enemies out, then a 6 on an advance roll, or maybe even a 5, can be a very useful thing and can actually be pretty game-changing. But you only want to do this if your army doesn't really need a 6 for Overwatch or damage. So, if you have a Farseer in the background and you can change anything to a 6, it's not really a big deal, then absolutely you can do a 6-inch, advance with a fate dice perhaps. And you're not really losing much by doing that. This can sometimes get you in such a good position that it can win you the game. So being able to advance roll 6 early is very important. In my last game against Orcs, this is one of the first things I did with my Dire Avengers is I advanced them forward and I used the 6 on a fate dice to do that. And this was basically to make sure that I had enough CP to both overwatch twice and use another stratagem if I wanted to, but also still be able to get my Dire Avengers into a good position to shoot. And once again, the only thing to consider is whether or not it's better to use a CP for it instead. So if you want to use Matchless Agility for it instead of using a fate dice, that is a determination you're going to have to make based on what the rest of your army can do, and if you're in a position to use a 6 for something better like Overwatch. And of course, if you're nearing the end of the game and you have a unit that can get to a certain place on the battlefield that will win you the game either by getting on an objective or scoring a secondary, then you definitely want to spend the fate dice doing that, because that is money in the bank, right? Whenever you can score and use your fate dice to score victory points, you should be doing it for that reason. Okay, on to saving throws. Now, saving throws were something that we had the privilege and the luxury of being able to use multiple times in a game when we had 12 fate dice. But unfortunately, even though it's tempting to use fate dice for saving throws now, unless that wound is going to kill your model, and it's the last weapon your opponent has that can kill it, it's usually going to be a waste, so you're better off saving your fate dice. I know it's tempting when you have a 4+ save to make or a 5+ save and you're like, you know what? That last cannon just went through. I'm just going to go ahead and auto pass it. And again, it's tempting, but if your opponent has other stuff to shoot at that falcon or whatever it is that you're trying to save, chances are it's going to die anyway, so you might as well just let it die. And save that 5 or 6 for a better opportunity. Fate dice for saving throws, in my honest opinion, are best used opportunistically, and you shouldn't plan anything around it. It's not like the old days where you'd use multiple dice per phase, or, you could hoard fate dice and you could use a bunch of them on, different units each one of your turns. It's not like that anymore. You do need to use them very sparingly now. And also, just a rule of thumb, it's best used on models with good saves or invols, so you don't have to spend high value fate dice on it. My personal rule for using fate dice on saves is that if I need to save on a 6 and my opponent has other weapons to kill that model, I'm not going to use that fate dice. I'm just going to let that model die. I typically am only comfortable using this on 4s, like a 4+ invulnerable save perhaps, to save a lone operative like an Autarch Wayleaper or a Farseer or something like that, because I know that both of those models are probably going to be hidden, or in the case of the Wayleaper, it's a lone operative, so my opponent only has a couple chances to kill that model anyway. And therefore, using a 4 on a fate dice can really throw a wrench into my opponent's plans. But of course, there are going to be, in general, better uses for fate dice, one of them being battle shock tests. So having good leadership, a leadership of 6+ army-wide, usually means that we're safe from failing battle shock tests, especially with a Wayleaper nearby. If you guys aren't aware, Wayleaper gives +1 to your leadership. But bad rolls, of course, do happen, even with the Wayleaper. So, if you're holding an objective, but your unit has to take battle shock because it took casualties, using a 5 will guarantee you pass, and using a 4 means you will pass on a 2+. So in most cases, 5 out of 6 times, if you use a 4 of a fate dice to pass a battle shock test, you will pass it. And of course, this really becomes more efficient when a Wayleaper is nearby giving +1 leadership. So basically a 4 will mean that you're going to auto pass, and a 3 is going to mean that you will pass on a 2+, meaning you can use those, not so great fate dice on a situation which really can win or lose you the game. And this is one of those things that we don't really talk about a lot as players in general, but during those last couple turns of the game, when your units are taking battle shock left and right, and they're trying to hold on to those primary objectives, you would really wish you had a 4 in your fate dice pile for a better chance at passing your battle shock test. And in my opinion, it's also one of the reasons why I'm very hesitant to use Fate Dice for saves always. I will, again, use it on things like the Way Leaper. But in general, I think Battle Shock tests are a little bit of a better opportunity to use a Fate Dice so that they'll have more impact on the game in general. Alright, so the last type of strands roll that you might want to consider is a charge roll. Typically, though, our units don't have too much trouble charging in. You know, Scorpions can infiltrate and very easily get a charge early in the game. Howling Banshees have advance and charge. Harlequins, of course, can get out of a Skyweaver and easily charge at that point with movement 8. And of course, we also have things like the Solitaire, which basically can go from one side of the board to the other and charge in just fine. However, having said that, if you are putting combat units in reserve, using a 6 can allow you to charge from reserve on a 3+, or a 2+ if near the Avatar. Now, I know it's really tempting to bring a unit out of reserve just so you can charge them in on a 3+. It's not that hard to make, obviously, but it's still not a guarantee unless you're, kind of bringing them in with the Avatar of Cain, and then it's a 2+, which is much more likely to happen. And this basically means that a third of the time it will fail and also eat up a Fate Dice. So personally, I would rather not use a 6 for a charge roll out of reserve. Sometimes in the game, I will use a Fate Dice to make sure that I do charge in and am successful, because that means I'm going to take an objective or score a secondary like Extend or something like that. But it's generally a bad idea to plan around a unit coming out of reserve and then, charging in on a 3+ with a 6 of a Fate Dice. One, you can't guarantee that you're going to get a 6 with your Fate Dice, obviously, when you roll at the beginning of the game. And two, you might fail the roll anyway, and if you fail it, then it's going to also eat a Fate Dice. So my advice there is use Rapid Ingress if you want to get into combat with units that are in reserve. You do spend a command point, but you're going to be in a much better position. You're not going to be able to be screened out as easily. And of course, your charges are going to be easier. So in conclusion, Fate Dice can be tricky to use, especially since we now have so few of them to work with. However, they can still be very useful if applied in the right situations. So yes, while we can't use them as freely as before, and we certainly can't just pile them on to dumpster our opponents within the first couple of turns like in the beginning of the edition, Fate Dice can still very well affect the flow of the battle and give you the advantage if used correctly. I'm not saying it's the best ability out there, but it's definitely something that when used with a little bit of tact can put you in a very favorable position on the battlefield. A nice Overwatch with the Avatar of Cain or a couple of Bright Lances can obviously put a big dent into an enemy heavy, which can alter your opponent's plans accordingly, or a good advance roll can make sure that you get to a position on the board so that you can score secondary or even sometimes primary victory points, or get into a favorable position on the battlefield, which will change the fate of the game. Or in some cases, a cheeky Fate Dice for a devastating wound can guarantee a kill on a vehicle that probably would have been pretty hard to take out otherwise. Alright everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thank you for watching. Let me know in the comment section what you guys like to use Fate Dice for, and what your general rules for using Fate Dice are. And of course, once again, I would like to thank all of my patrons and supporters for supporting the channel over the last 1.5 years. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow significantly. If you do want to help support the channel and join the channel's Patreon, I have, of course, free trials activated for that, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I'll leave the link for that in the description below. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to grab some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, or some Eldar-inspired apparel on my channel store page, I will leave the link in the description for those as well. Alright everybody, that's going to be it for today. Thanks for watching once again. More content to come, so stay tuned, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.